2019 Green Team meeting. Thank you to our Committee on the Environment and the city staff and my colleagues on the council for rescheduling this very quickly. Originally, we had this scheduled for the Monday that we received the snow, and so had to reschedule for this evening. We did want to fit this in before the council begins our priority setting retreats, which start tomorrow, and then we have it on Tuesday as well. So we wanted to at least start the conversation with you, but as you know from past years and past meetings, we love meeting and talking with the Committee on the Environment. We love all our committees, but we love meeting with all of you. And so if we aren't able to, cover all of our topics this evening, please don't feel like we've missed an opportunity. We can always come back and, I would imagine, continue conversations. The purpose for tonight's meeting is to discuss joint priorities between the Committee on the Environment and the City Council, known as our Green Team priorities. We're going to identify specific areas in which the committee can provide input on City Council initiative, activities, and outreach opportunities that relate to the environment. Recommended Green Team actions is either tonight or in the future, approve or revise updated Green Team priorities and identify 2 or 3 areas for joint action. So that's what we hope to do. I'm not sure if we have to spend too much time on introductions since all of us have name tags and I think we all know each other. So I think we can just jump in. The first item was an updates on our energy sustainability and other environmental efforts and the latest GHG inventory outlook for a new action plan. And I think I'm turning this over to our sustainability manager, correct? Gina Mathias?
Hi. So I think everyone in the room has actually heard our update on sustainability from 2018 and what we're focusing on for 2019. But I'll give a brief overview and hopefully that'll leave some more time for discussion. In 2018, we focused on low-income single-family energy efficiency retrofits. We had a sizable grant from the Maryland Energy Administration and we were able to give complete energy efficiency makeovers to 9 homeowners, and their average energy savings was over $500 per home. So we're really happy with that. This winter, if there are homeowners, low-income homeowners who need energy efficiency retrofits for their homes, there are resources available through Montgomery County that they can take advantage of. So we're still able to offer that assistance to homeowners this winter through different revenue areas or different grant programs. Tacoma Park also hosted the 4th Green Fest last year at Jessup Blair Park. It was the 3rd time out of 4 years they hosted in Tacoma Park. We had 1,200 attendees. For 2019, the county made the decision to move Green Fest to coincide with Brookside Gardens' annual Earth Day Festival, just so there's no more duplication of effort and resources. So that will be there, and yes. There is a date selected. I don't know what day it is. It's whenever, I think it's around April 22nd, maybe? Does that sound right for Earth Day? Also, we participated in the county-wide solar co-op. So instead of running it just as a city, we've moved to joining in with the county for a county-wide solar co-op and plan to keep the city participating with the county on the solar co-ops to continue increasing the adoption of solar systems on single-family homes in the city. And lastly, last year we got an update to our greenhouse gas inventory, and that update was completed for the year 2015. We saw a small increase in emissions overall, but there are a lot of factors that go into our emissions, and one of the biggest is weather. And 2015 was both hotter and colder than 2012 when our last inventory was completed. So when we take into account the weather, our emissions went down overall. But if we don't take into account the weather, there was a rise. And so That brings us to really needing to think very hard about if our programs are doing enough to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions citywide. The next update is scheduled to be completed for 2018. According to COG, the data, all of the data won't actually be available until 2020. So we may have some preliminary results at the end of this year, but we won't have final results until the end of 2020, unfortunately, just the way the data becomes available. This year, the big focus is on multifamily energy efficiency. We have a cool program running with a company called New Ecology, or an organization called New Ecology. We are working with multifamily buildings in the city that have central boiler systems, and we are installing monitoring equipment and then optimizing their systems over the course of a year or 20 months, and keeping those systems optimized and working with the building staff in those buildings to keep it running smoothly, and that will achieve energy savings and help improve the quality of services in those buildings. There'll be fewer disruptions in hot water service and heat in those buildings through that project. The project kicked off in December, and we are still working to recruit buildings. We need a total of 6 buildings to participate in the program, so we're still working on finalizing which of those 6 buildings will be participating, and I'll let everybody know when we have our final roster of buildings. And then lastly is our update to the Sustainable Energy Action Plan. So our 2014 Sustainable Energy Action Plan, we've implemented almost all of it. There were 17 key strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions citywide, and we've worked our way through almost all of them that we can implement. And it's time to take a very serious, long, hard look at what the city is going to do in the next 5 to 10 years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Just in the last 5 years, there's been really big changes in how cities are doing their energy planning and their climate planning. So I expect this iteration of the Energy Action Plan to be very different than what the 2014 one looks like. I think it'll be much more aggressive from what I'm seeing on their cities coming up with. And we have 2 really great resources regionally, CADMIS and ICF. We'll be choosing one of those companies to work with through the MWCOG rider clause. They contracted with those companies to provide climate and energy planning services region-wide. We'll be issuing a task order request to both companies, and hopefully within the next 5 to 6 weeks, get responses back from them and be able to choose which one to go with. And the process for the update will be public, lots of conversations will need to be had with lots of data, hopefully from whichever company we go with.
Great, thank you. Any questions either from our Committee on the Environment or the City Council? Councilwoman DeBala?
I'd just like to add that I heard the presentations from both CADMIS and the other company this morning at the COG meeting I was at. And they're both very impressive, a lot of work experience in the region, a lot of program experience on what's new and innovative. So I felt pretty good about that.
Okay.
And cheaper than going out on our own.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or? All right, well, thank you for that update. And now we'll move to review of the previous Green Team priorities, and I think I'm going to turn it over to you all. I think you need to, is there a button there? No? Just talk? All right. No, it's not on. No, talk again? No. Do I need to do something? Okay.
Sounds like it's
on.
Now it's on, yep.
So I'll call your attention to page 3 of your handout. This is reviewing the previous Green Team priorities, which we worked on at our meeting last March. I'm not sure the city got the final draft and formally adopted this last version, but it's what we worked on together via our meeting and follow-up meetings. You'll note that there are 3 tiers. Yes, July 10, 2018. That's the last time the committee made any changes to it. So there are 3 tiers, and I think there's 9 bullet points here. And we've gone for a much simplified approach, but if you'd like to, I'll just read the headlines. Under Tier 1, carbon emissions reduction and urban tree canopy. It's kind of a global climate change action and also a more local environmental focus. Tier 2, under we had waste management, transportation, and water quality, which tend to be pretty locally focused. And then Tier 3, stormwater development projects, open space, and considering any environmental aspects of council priorities or actions. So that's just the old one. We're not trying to spend a whole lot of time with it, but we wanted to have it as a reference of what we worked on before and what we're proposing to change to. So if there are any questions to this, we could try to field them now. It should probably be noted that stormwater is Tier 3, though it's a large expenditure by the city due to some of the state regulations and funding sources, dedicated funding sources and staff that it has. And that urban tree canopy is kind of in progress right now with the tree ordinance review and survey and all that goes with that, along with all the energy action plan stuff that Gina mentioned as the primary focus of her work. So any questions for this page? So we're ready to move on. So the next page, we tried to pare this down a lot, partly in response to some of the reports that were coming out this fall and a desire to really hone in on what we propose that the city really focus on, budget for, and allocate staff time and advocacy or policy changes towards. We still put a kind of overarching goal on the top of to review any actions the council is considering. That's partly the Committee on the Environment's role, both proactively and reactively to council requests on different policy proposals such as the straw ban or any other actions that would have some environmental component that we'd like to give you our input on. But the big change here is we've gone to 2 priorities, and one is squarely and primarily focused on climate change response. This response is both actions that help reduce our emissions and also has a look towards what we can do in the terms of mitigation, adaptation to any changes that may be coming up. One thing that's not on this page, and which would probably be underneath both priorities 1 and 2, is consideration of stormwater. In talking with Cindy and relaying some of the mayor's concerns, we've recognized that stormwater is one of the impacts that is most likely to affect the residents of Tacoma Park, and where the city's kind of in a good position to be doing both municipal projects and maybe potentially coordinating resident projects in some cooperative efforts that help manage the response to increased storm water resulting from major storms that are faster, shorter, and more intense. So I don't know if people want to have any questions about our priority one climate change response. The graph here, I believe, is the same one that you'll find in the. I don't know. It's not. Where's this graph from, Gina?
It's from the greenhouse gas inventory
Yeah, there it
update
is.
on page 2.
So it's a copy of that report, which was our 2015 results, which gives us a place to consider focusing on where our largest sources of emissions are within the city. And, leads us to look at buildings. As you can see, it's about 3/4 of our emissions are related to our buildings. And not the municipal buildings, which are just a very small sliver. That's kind of an action the city takes both to be good stewards of financial resources, but also to be a good example. But reaching out to the residential sector and commercial buildings is probably the biggest place that we want to propose some future actions. And this doesn't propose specific actions, we're just talking about the priority areas to focus on. So,
I
guess,
assume the apartment buildings fall under the residential
yes.
counts? Is there any way to break those out?
No, so a change between 2012 and 2015 in the way Pepco does their billing is that multifamily buildings are now under commercial.
Okay. Thank you.
So for emissions purposes, they're in commercial or? For emissions purposes, they were in commercial or residential in this pie chart?
Commercial.
Thank you.
Do we have the ability of breaking out the apartments from other commercial buildings or no?
We can make a special request from Pepco for that data, but what we received right now, we don't have that ability.
Okay, thank you.
And I had a question. I think it's great to prioritize with these kind of larger buckets this year, but do you feel like this also gives you an opportunity to prioritize the more specific things that you're looking at? Just looking at the priorities from last year versus this year, it's a much more general look this year versus some of the more nitty-gritty of trees and stormwater and waste management and transportation that were listed in the ones for last year.
I think there's a pretty good effort to defocus on a lot of those smaller items. You'll find in priority number 2, it's somewhat of a catch. All it's catching many of those buckets, but it's clearly putting them as a secondary towards a focus on the emissions and climate change.
And thank you for calling out stormwater particularly. I think as all of us have been experiencing lately and the city manager has been talking about, it is, especially this fall, it has been really a huge issue for many residents. And as you said in your presentation, you talked about adaptation as well as mitigation. And so I think as we finalize the document, adding that to the actual climate change response, because the language right now just talks about mitigating the causes, if that was amenable to the committee.
Yeah, we were discussing it in our internal meetings and picked response as a bit of a catch-all phrase, and also to avoid having to define mitigation or adaptation and just say we're gonna work on it. But I would like, especially with the inclusion of stormwater as a specific topic, have our committee or in conjunction review and adopt that as part of priority 1.
Thank you. Any other questions or clarifications on the overarching priorities? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I did have another question. So, in priority 2, you have urban forest health. That also, to me, has a climate change component. And so did you not mention it in number 1 because it was in number 2, or is it like stormwater in number 1, it's implied? And if we wanted to spell it out, does it say it specifically in number 1?
I'd agree there are impacts and they're interrelated.
What I meant was under priority 2, the first sentence says will be affected by climate change, so
Right,
there's a
okay,
reference
so-
back to that way.
So number 2 is focused more on environmental issue. I'm asking a question. Is number 2 more focused on environmental issues that have a climate change aspect, like stormwater, like forest health?
I don't think exclusively. I think many of them are overlapping, but I think priority 2 lets us take action on stuff that doesn't necessarily have a climate impact. There might be an urban forest health priority for biodiversity and aesthetic or citizen health as opposed to a larger climate change goal. It's a way to catch and address some issues that don't have a direct climate change, but we're acknowledging that if you picked properly or strategically, you'd get hit both buckets with it.
There's also a recognition that there's a committee on trees, so that it's not that we think it's not important, but we're not the only committee working on it.
Great, and I know in the past, that the Committee on the Environment, I think you weighed in officially on the plastic straws. Is that correct?
We gave you a statement.
Yes, we did, okay. And so,
I was just gonna bring up straws.
yeah, and so moving forward for thinking about council priorities and the work that we're going to do over the next year, I would imagine that the Committee on the Environment would consider that under priority 2.
Yes, and I think it's somewhat strategically not directly included. I mean, we were asked to consider it, and we did not deem it a top priority. A number of our members are working on the campaign directly, but as a group, we voted that it wasn't a top priority environmentally because of impacts, but it does have this amazing engagement and motivating factor, which we do value. So even though, on a emissions standpoint, or even I think percentage of solid waste, it's a small piece. The visibility and the day-to-day interaction that it provides to have a conversation with people and take a first step towards, potentially banning all plastics or something like that, is a valuable thing. But
I think we're also hoping that it wouldn't take a huge amount of the council's time
Yes.
to deal with the straw issues, because there seems to be a lot of support for it. And some of the other things on the Committee on the Environment priorities would take up more time. They're more complex issues. So
Great. Well, thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that point. Councilmember Smith?
Thank you. Apologize, I was late. A resident stopped me to talk about the Flower Avenue Green Street, the delay. So I apologize. Couple things. When you talk about personal vehicles, do you guys look at hybrids or Tesla type vehicles, or is it just combustion, the 8% that's being generated by personal vehicles? And are you looking at or considering micro mobility devices like the e-bikes or scooters, or is any of that being considered?
Gina, do you know the details on the data?
Yeah, so the data for vehicle miles traveled comes through various forms regionally. We rely on COG for that data going forward. In 2012, I believe there was a survey done to develop some more localized data on vehicle miles traveled. So in general, it will look at vehicle miles as it pertains to personal vehicles in all categories. But that data is not as reliable and accurate as it could be. It's very expensive and difficult to get.
Okay. Another thing is recycling. I read this recent piece that says that single stream recycling is not as effective as it used to be. Have you guys looked at that? Or, since we're trying to ban all these things like plastic bags or hopefully straws, is that something that you guys have even thought about?
I want to
And is there
defer.
an alternative? And should we ban, plastic bottles, or find a different way, put a deposit on, bottles, glass bottles, so that, there's more money out there to do something about this. And then just finally, I don't know if you watched that piece on 60 Minutes about how now plastic is getting into our food supply. And, this is like, to me, a call to action, that we really need to come up with major policy initiatives to try to push against this.
So one of the short answers is that we should refer to Daryl and Public Works on the data she has for recycling and waste management. But if you're looking at the chart here, our emissions inventory is only giving a 2% measure of that item. And that's solid waste that we deal with and dispose of in the city. It doesn't track the manufacture of those products that are off in other communities primarily, because we don't have industry here. So if we're strategically looking at big piece of the pie to attack, that's not one of them.
All right.
Even though it has a more tangible day-to-day feeling and interaction with people and consumers and citizens,
Okay.
a la the straw ban or the other plastic issues.
We just heard, I think Daryl, this is your info, that for the first time, Tacoma Park is now paying more tipping fees for recyclables than for trash.
Wow.
Which, yeah.
Not to belabor the point, but we spend a lot of time internally thinking about recycling and effectiveness and cost-benefit analysis related to single stream versus dual stream. Dual stream requires more staff, more
Right.
trucks, more emissions. So there's a lot of factors that go into comparing them. But first and foremost, processing drives recycling. Markets drive processing. So unless you have an end use for your recycling, you don't have the recycling circle. I and my colleagues in the solid waste field are watching very closely what's happening globally. And if you're a pessimist, we have reason to worry that the state of recycling is going to drastically change
Right.
unless something drastically changes with the economy and the global marketplace. So the first sign of that is tip fees rising. The processing facilities have to charge more because it costs more to prepare the materials for markets. There are less markets available to them than there used to be. So we may be looking in the future at reduced amount of recyclables that we can even collect. And again, the processing facilities will drive that. They'll say they're not going to process what they can't market and move. So the industry may start shaving off paper, shaving off plastics, shaving off glass. We may be left with very few items that maintain a resale value or recycling value. But anyway, so it's hard to know at this point, but it is something we keep an eye on, and COG in particular is doing a lot of work and research in that regard.
Right.
And just a note, I mean, you'll see this in budget, upcoming budget stuff, that we have to budget more money for this.
Okay. Thank you, Daryl. I appreciate your team thinking about this. Thank you, guys.
Councilmember Kovar?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation and the information. Some people have talked about declaring climate change emergencies. Is that something you've looked at, and would it require us to do certain things, or is that just kind of a statement that we think this is serious, which you've already done by listing it as number one?
We have not formally considered recommending to the council that we make such a declaration. In the past, the mayors signed on to the Climate Change Mayors Council and various other
Many
county
other
programs.
things.
Many. It's another step up. It's in alignment with this new priorities. I don't know what obligations it comes with. I don't know that it's been even defined fully. We could consider it. We are proposing to have it at our next meeting, and especially if the council would like to hear a recommendation on it.
So, with housing, we're working on a strategic plan that would cover from now until 2030. At least that's what we hope to have, and certainly with the Sustainability Office, there are targets and periods of time for us to aim toward. Do folks on the committee think that it would make sense for us to set, something like 10 years from now or whatever it would be, that we should hit some, carbon neutrality level? Or again, is that not, you just haven't gotten that far in the thinking yet?
We do have piggybacked on the county's emissions targets currently, which are 80% by some near future date. We could.
80% by 2027, 100% by 2035.
So that's, you're recommending that, or?
We have already signed
We've
on to
already
that.
done
Yeah, okay.
As is-
Okay. And then, in terms of, maybe this doesn't matter, but for everything we consider here, we have environmental considerations that we consider for when we adopt or pass resolutions and so on. Does that automatically include or embrace climate change, or should it be made to more explicitly include climate change, or is it fine to just sort of say, well, here's the environmental impact of things that we do. I mean, in other words, in order to make something really be a number one priority, does it have to be pushed forward more actively into everything that we do? Or do you think it's just a series of steps that we would take?
I think we would first look at our priorities that are agreed upon jointly and consider any council action with those priorities in mind, and then also other environmental considerations as appropriate. But as using this document as our first step, pass. So,
And then, thank you. The one last question I had is, you know, a lot of times you hear that from people who maybe don't want to take certain steps, that there's a cost associated with that, you know, whatever the economic impacts are of, you know, insisting on cleaner water or air or whatever it is. But what never seems to get calculated in is that there are costs of doing nothing. So it's not as if we sit here and there's never any costs, so doing these things costs more money. If we sit here and do nothing, there are major costs there too. And you touch on, you know, physical, social, and economic well-being, obviously, so the costs go beyond just the purely monetary. But have you thought much about how a municipality could sort of calculate that, so that, in other words, if we say, okay, I don't know, if we impose some sort of, or encourage restrictions on certain types of activities here connected to where the big sources of emissions were, is there a way to show that even if there's an upfront cost, there's a savings down the road? I'm not sure if I'm phrasing it that clearly, but
I think I understand. There would be a balance, ideally, but you would look at a proposed action and have a fiscal impact outlook for it. For most things, you could do at least a general estimate. Other things would be a little harder to measure. But then at some point, there's a question of whether you're going to take the action regardless or in the face of not saving money. I think the
Right.
easy picking, low-hanging fruit would be the ones that are both saving money and doing good for the environment and emissions, and you do those quickly and without too much effort, and to think long and hard, as Gina was saying, about the bigger actions which might not have a cost savings. There would be a cost addition. And that's what the climate emergency would indicate, that you take more consideration of the actions that aren't just cost neutral.
okay, thank you.
If I could follow up, Peter, I mean, these questions you're asking, this is really the heart of the matter, you know, what is it that the city can actually do? And certainly we, as the Committee of the Environment, can put together some action recommendations and, you know, working with Gina. I guess we have one more meeting with Gina before she goes on maternity, which is a little concern.
She's coming back.
Yeah. How long? But it really, you know, that's really the question here, is how important is this to Tacoma Park? And I guess we will have the city sustainability energy action plan that we need to redo over the next year or so. And I assume that the committee, a lot of our recommendations will be part of the process that puts that action plan together. But generally, I mean, for energy, you have supply and demand. And I know, you know, Gina's been talking about the importance of reducing demand, which is critical, but also for supply, getting control over our electric wires. I mean, how can we prevent fossil fuels from coming into this town through the grid? And it's not so easy, but apparently there's a mechanism at the state level that could give a municipality that authority. So we are very interested in that and want to pursue that. And short of that, there are some other options. Of basically requiring, in some fashion, everyone to get renewable energy, or creating a fee if you don't get renewable energy for every home. And some of these things, you know, we haven't really looked into them, but these also, if there are particular questions like that the council would like us to look into, I think that would maybe help us focus our efforts to provide you with research recommendations on particular topics. And I know you kind of do that through Gina, which works. She will come to us and tell you and ask us to, you know, help think through something. So that's how we've been working so far.
Okay, thank you.
I think this is a good time. Councilwoman DeBow, did you have something else to
A good
mention?
time to,
I was going to say, what Mr. Ackerley just said, I feel like is a good transition to the next agenda item, but if you had to think about if we're looking at these priorities with the feedback we've just given the committee.
Sure.
And then the next item, I think, is sort of the future actions and how, like, now we have the priorities. And, you know, where do we go from here? What I heard Councilmember Kovar put on the table so far is to particularly one action and what would be the benefit of us declaring a climate change emergency. What would that benefit be? What would the outcome of that be? What would it actually mean for us as a council and for you as the Committee on the Environment? We are moving forward with the sustainability action plan in the next year, and so I know that's going to take a good deal of time. But are there other actions or things that the committee has thought of that you'd like to present tonight or the council would like to ask about?
One thing I do want to point out is that right now our emissions inventory, which is driving and will drive our next sustainable energy action plan, is a measure of emissions that are kind of within the city. Cars traveling through the city, buildings that are in the city, manufacturing that's in the city, which is almost non-existent, or agriculture within the city, which is non-existent. Air travel is not existent. So if you look at there was one graph on one of the final pages. Let's see, second to last page, the bar chart. It shows some of the categories that are not counted in our emissions inventory, such as passenger air travel and agriculture, like as it relates to food production. On a global impact scale, production of food and types of food and passenger air travel are big emissions sources. Since they're not happening in the city, they're not measured by the city, even though consumer choices by residents or how people travel in the city, I would think our air travel profile for the city is above national averages. And, you know, for instance, so one thing that could help inform future actions or ways that we plug into the climate change reduction strategies is to have a consumption-based inventory, which looks at how consumer choices, travel choices, choosing plastic manufactured goods choices locally or not locally, international foods and such things, what impact that has and whether the city is in a position to advocate for or promote some kind of emissions reductions on those scales. So one potential future action is to consider a consumption-based or consumer inventory. And it's not the industry standard, but I feel like it's missing some of these larger components which come down to the actions of citizens and potentially are related to how the government promotes and does policy. So no more flying around the country for those meetings.
Yeah. Yeah, you tell my boss that. Right. Any other actions?
Yeah, one other that we talked about a little bit is, I mean, it's not the role of Tacoma Park traditionally to get into building codes or energy standards, but if there was a way that we could do that to require all homes in Tacoma Park within a certain period of time to meet certain levels of weatherization, I mean, that would be a huge step. It's and you'd have to have funding for lower income families to meet that, because it would require expenditure. You can require that when a home is sold. You know, if a home is sold, that home has to meet certain energy standards. But that would take so long in Tacoma Park to make much of a difference that I think we should consider something more aggressive.
Yeah, Councilmember Kovar?
Yeah, that just reminds me of one thing, and I was talking about this today, but it's something that I've been wondering about for a few years, and dating back to when I was wanting to put more efficient windows on my house, and I'm in the historic district, but not really in a historic house myself. And I understand a lot of this is county, although maybe the facade board gets into it in certain cases with commercial property. But right now we have a situation where when historic preservation and energy efficiency meet, historic preservation seems to win out. And I think we should fight to keep and preserve the important historical kinds of features that we have in the community. But I just wonder whether there's a more of an even way of doing that, and whether that would potentially make a difference too, because you know, there are people who want to make their homes more energy efficient, and sometimes they can't because of these other considerations. I mean, is that something that has come up in your discussions at all?
Yeah, it has.
Nodding, but I'm just
And
wondering.
we don't have a simple solution, obviously. But no, yeah, it is a concern. But I think a lot of the windows are one of the last things, and one of the most expensive ways to upgrade your house. I mean, sometimes it's key, but there's a lot of things short of that. Basic weatherization, things that a energy auditor would recommend if you have a blower door test. So, but yeah, maybe, I don't know enough about the Historic Commission, how that works, but there may be a balance there that can be rejigged.
I have a question for the, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
It'd probably be worth exploring some of the rebate programs they have for historical areas. I mean, typically maintaining a historical house costs more money. And I think some areas are sold as, you know, fancy historic areas that you pay more to be in, and there's a cost for that. And if there's a mandatory energy efficiency standard, then you just kind of eat the cost and pay for the more expensive window upgrade. But like John said, you know, the energy savings windows are usually low on the list of priorities. But they might be included because you need to meet that new standard that might be proposed.
This question actually came up when Councilmember Siemens and I were doing an afternoon coffee at one of the apartment buildings, is for the windows in apartment buildings. Can the city have authority over that? Is that a county issue?
I don't think it's either, except that often when multifamily buildings are renovated or whatever, I mean, there's certainly code requirements, and sometimes there's special requirements based on where they get the money from. And there may be other information on that. We have obviously lobbied at times to get better, more efficient windows, and that'd be part of our discussions when we're trying to save apartment owners money and provide a healthier environment for residents. But I know sometimes there's things where there's a sense, we'll make the windows smaller. And then there's other issues which we don't like either. So part of this is the balance, but I don't believe that we have the role. Whether we're completely precluded from a role is another question. We'd have to investigate that.
I would like to suggest, though, that maybe we could craft a letter to an apartment building and as a test case, and see if maybe we could use that as a persuasion tool to encourage them to be more energy efficient.
I think Ms. Mathias has, when she meets with them, she talks about that, but I don't know if there's something in specific we could work together on a letter of some kind.
Yeah, I would like to work with her maybe, and because I'm not sure whether you were dealing with the owners or the management, the property management companies, or which, but maybe we could try something.
Okay.
We'll do
Thank
it
you.
quickly. Great. Councilwoman DeBala.
Yeah, thank you for the recommendations. Compared to this time last year, I admit I'm feeling a fair amount of urgency about this #1 priority. Just in the past year, I think we have seen here in Tacoma Park the human impacts of not doing enough. And we've seen it in stormwater, we've seen it in energy bills, we've seen it hitting the people who need, who feel it the most. When you're paying 10, 12, 15% of your income for energy, then that's a real human impact to people that live here. And so I'm really intrigued by what the possibilities are for ramping up. I went to a presentation this morning on the new DC bill, which includes energy standards similar to what John was describing. And I'd be very interested to hear, as an option, what that would look like here, how you would phase that in, as they have in DC over time, to hit, and how you would finance it as they have in DC over time to address the concerns about differential impacts on different building renters and owners. So I look back at the resolution that we had this time last year, where we embraced the county's, at that point, 80% reduction greenhouse gas emissions goal. And one of the things that we have in here is seeking recommendations from the city sustainability manager on how to ramp up. And perhaps we've been remiss in not insisting on seeing that sooner. But I would really like to do that. That would be, if
So I think-
3/4 of our emissions are buildings, then I think it's on us to see what a more aggressive program looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think through the update for the Sustainable Energy Action Plan, there will be some very interesting proposals on the table. I've certainly been exploring these ideas through my networks with other cities and exploring what they've done, such as what DC is doing with the minimum energy standards. Boulder's doing some interesting things, Berkeley, Portland. There's lots of good case studies that we can draw from to create a new aggressive program for Tacoma Park. So I really look forward to sharing some of those ideas over the next 6 to 12 months.
And a program that doesn't impact the people who can least afford to have,
It helps.
that will help the folks who need the help
Yes.
the most. Thank you.
Great.
I guess I would like to just note that, I'm certainly very scared about the impact of climate change on Tacoma Park and Tacoma Park residents. And so for that reason, there's a number of things that we're investigating as ways to address it. The idea that so much of our greenhouse gases come from buildings is not easy to get one's head around for most residents, I think. And so part of this is an education effort that I think has not taken place. What does that really mean? So I do, for those who live and breathe it, it may be completely understandable, but I think most people don't think that their house is causing the problem. And so really trying to find ways to learn about it. It'll be interesting to see the information. I know we have an article coming out in the newsletter to provide some more information, but I think there is a whole education effort that goes into that I think will be required for agreement to more significant steps. And so I look forward to working with everybody about how do we do an education effort on that while we're continuing to take other meaningful steps on these other aspects as well that have to do with the Committee on the Environment.
Great. And could I ask, I know the newsletter article is coming out soon, but before Ms. Mathias goes out on maternity leave, maybe CDTV could do an interview with her, because I think sometimes sharing things through, oh, come on.
I love doing city TV interviews.
I know, but you look so sad when I said that. I think sometimes being able to have a video to share through social media or in other events. I know Tacoma Park Mobilization this Saturday is holding a, what are they calling it, meeting? A get-together.
Climate training.
A what?
Climate response training. I
Yeah,
like the
climate
title.
response training. And so hopefully folks will get a lot of this information there as well. But I do think, working with the Committee on the Environment and each of us on the City Council, I agree with Councilwoman DeBala that this is, we thought all this was urgent last year, and I think this fall has really brought this all very close to home, particularly the stormwater issues. And so having the newsletter article and the interview, I think will be helpful tools in educating people on this. And I guess that would be the one thing I would ask in terms of action items, is specifically to have us, and I know the city manager has been thinking about this, but thinking about action items on stormwater, and how we're going to think about addressing that. And in the future, one of the things that we do as a city is deal with stormwater on public property. We don't deal with it when it's on people's private property for lots of reasons. But unfortunately, I think as we're experiencing more and more issues between neighbors and in entire sections of our community, the city government is going to have to play a more active role and proactive role in assisting residents on private property. And so how do we go about doing that and putting in place programs that help residents bring neighbors together and develop stormwater plans that will impact private properties is a pretty big undertaking, but I think that's the direction that we're going to need to go into in the next few years. So that would be, I don't know, the city manager has more to say on that.
Well, everything here we're talking about has money implications, and we're a very small budget city. And so one of the things that to me is really important is that as this prioritization and a plan get underway, that we also really advocate for those entities that have more funds than we do or have more influence than we do, whether it's at the county, state, or federal levels, or with certain granting entities, because we can't just fix everybody's house, especially if they don't have very much money, and we really can't do those things. And so I think the more that we have an effort to really specify what we need to do and then be able to really lobby for that, as well as do our own part, I think is really important. And instead of just talking to ourselves, I think the more that we also have a plan for talking to others would be really helpful. And again, love to help craft that. Thank you.
Yes, and we've already started that conversation with our delegation when they were here in December. And so, yes, we did that. Yeah.
So I do have a question about this.
Wait, let me get you a microphone.
I'll talk really loud.
Okay.
For people at home. The county has a program, I think it's called Rainscape.
Yes.
And that has, provides up to $7,500 per individual property and $20,000 for commercial. So I was looking into this because I do have a lane that drains completely down my property and through it and is eroding it. And it said, if you're from Tacoma Park, you need not apply because the Tacoma Park has its own programs. And so I was going to explore that, but now I'm hearing that indeed Tacoma Park doesn't have its own programs with regard to private property. So I'm wondering, what's the story here?
Actually, we're coming with a different proposal for the city of Tacoma Park. We've just had a presentation 2 weeks ago, I guess, about a different approach so that we can assist people with the work that they do on their own property. But the Rainscape program probably isn't the right match for us.
Yeah.
Happy to talk with you offline about the opportunities that we have for
Well,
this.
I was wondering, because it said that the Tacoma Park did have, there's funding, that, I guess, through the stormwater.
Yes.
And so I guess the county is using some of that money, and other municipalities are using that to do on private property Rainscape things. But I
Right,
guess
so-
Tacoma Park also gets a share of that money too, correct?
No, we're
We have a
separate.
separate stormwater utility
Right, okay,
fee.
that's what I'm saying. Excuse me,
Yeah.
but-
Yeah, we
but-
have a separate stormwater utility fee.
Yeah,
Probably
yeah.
the best source of information is the city budgets
Right.
each year where we identify the projects. Our
Yeah.
focus has been on large public right-of-way projects
Yeah.
to meet the state and federal requirements for treatment and
Yeah.
stormwater management. So with the budget we have and the very long list of projects we have, we don't have the ability to rebate or fund projects on private property.
And I will say, the point I was trying to make before is not just a private property owner being able to do a rainscape.
Yeah.
This goes far beyond that. I
Yeah.
can list in every single neighborhood, in every ward,
Yeah.
at least 2 or 3 places where there is a stormwater issue that is going to necessitate a group of homeowners,
Yeah.
5, 10, coming together and figuring out this plan and looking at their property and their homes. And so that goes far beyond the county program.
So I'm happy to talk with you offline, and I can describe
good.
some of the
Okay.
opportunities that we have, that we're looking at coming up.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah.
But as far as I know, I mean, I think there are some cities that may be just starting to look at this, but the city manager's been looking at this, and not to put you on the spot, but there's not a lot out there. Yeah.
Mayor, could I ask one other,
That's right.
Yeah.
question? Not on stormwater, sorry.
Okay, we can move on, stormwater.
No,
I did my thing.
I agree with you 100% on stormwater. In fact, I have more than 2 in the area that I represent. I was just curious if Gina, and you can provide this later if you don't have the number at hand, but when the competition was done with the different sections of the city on energy efficiency and so on, is there an estimate that you have, or could we get what the aggregate reduction in emissions was of that whole process? Because in looking at, the pie chart, the biggest contributor is the electrical, well, the heating and cooling, I suppose, of private homes, right?
Yes, so I don't have the exact numbers on hand with me. I can tell you that the estimated energy savings from the Neighborhood Energy Challenge were far greater than what we see in the actual realized reductions in energy use. We had about 20% of single-family homes in the city participate in that challenge. That was the voluntary-based program. And so I think this is one reason why we're seeing cities make the shift away from the voluntary programs to mandatory programs, because the estimates aren't always lining up with what we realize in energy savings. And I can send the group around those actual numbers.
Really, it just struck me, if that's the biggest chunk, and, that took a ton of work, and you had community leaders, having pep rallies and all of that, but it seems like we need to figure out what's the next set of steps to address home energy use. And even some of us who got like a medium green color, maybe we need to go for the next level. But maybe it's not just that process, but some other steps that people can take too that we would figure out, because it looks like if we don't address the home energy, we're kind of working around the edges where there's maybe not as much to do to make a difference, right?
Absolutely. I think there's a natural progression to how cities address energy use in buildings. And we've done a tremendous job with the voluntary and incentive-based programs. And so I think the natural evolution is to look at what's next.
Part of the issue on this is that most of the buildings in Tacoma Park are older. So if you go to a community where it's a lot of new construction, it's much more energy efficient. So everything that we would be having to work with is retrofitting or correcting existing construction.
And also, we don't have those other large industrial and agricultural sources of emissions. And so when you look at our pie chart, there's not as many pieces of the pie that we're counting. And so the buildings do dominate our emissions in the city.
I had another question. Some residents have brought to us wanting us to think about taking up banning gas-powered leaf blowers. And I'm looking at this pie chart and again this conversation where to put our efforts. And the Committee on the Environment you all don't need to give a response now, but unlike plastic straws, which even will take us time even, I see taking up a banning of gas-powered leaf blowers as something that would be very time-consuming for the City Council to take up. And that doesn't mean we don't do it, but looking again at this pie chart in this conversation, looking at where that would actually fit in and where our efforts should be in the next couple of years. So I don't know if folks have thoughts on that now, or if we should add that to the list of things to come back to in the future.
I don't see it on the chart, so it must
Can I use that over the next year if it's not on the chart?
No, I think characterizing it like the straws is pretty apt, and I would anticipate you get more pushback on leaf blowers than on the straws. It might be on the emissions inventory update. It might be captured under gasoline emissions, which is all sorts of emissions there. But I imagine it's a small piece, but it's a very public piece. I mean, if you were like the trees, you know, you come to Como Park, you see the trees, you note the trees, even though they're just kind of sitting there. If you came to town and you never heard a gas-powered leaf blower, it would be a subtle change, but it would be one that was notable and impacting, you know, a day-to-day experience of you know, livability in the city. And there are arguments for air quality and asthma and mold distribution as well. So I think it doesn't rise to the top one priority. And if it's anticipated to be a hard slog to get it done, then probably it makes sense to focus on something we think has a bigger impact.
You'll have to take your request to the Noise Commission.
Is there also a noise issue with them?
Right, I
With
think,
Yeah.
Dolly on
I
our-
think that
Yeah.
it's not just a climate change issue, because
Yeah.
it's not as if, I mean, I think what DC has done, and it takes several years before it goes into effect, is it allows the use of battery powered, so there's still, you know, some impact in terms of however that's generated. I don't know what the battery production process is like, but it's both a noise question, because evidently they're quieter, and the impact on the use of gasoline. So it's quality of life as much as, or in part along with that. And, you know, I think maybe the argument is that, you know, if there are garden services and more places that where they work don't allow that, then they begin to switch over. And I think that's why the DC allowed a couple of years to go by, as opposed to just making it immediate, so.
Yeah, we're not making a decision on that tonight. I
No.
just wanted
No.
to be clear.
I just wanted to clarify
Yeah.
that it's both of both
Right.
those components to it, yeah.
And as we said before, sometimes we do things for other reasons other than where it fits on this chart we're looking at now, so. Great. Any other action items?
So this is so I'm a firm believer in, if you want to change behavior, you kind of meet people where they are, right? And so it seems that most of the behavioral change kind of needs to happen in the home, right? So we're trying to ask people to, you know, either plant more trees on their property, or do a weatherization project within their home, or maybe be more energy efficient within their home. Have you all identified like other programs? So like, when I bought my house, I didn't know anything about energy efficiency. Called up Pepco, got some little thing in the mail that says, "Oh, we'll come out and we'll test your house for free." I'm like, "Free? I like it." So, and so I learned a lot about where I was losing air, you know, just from having that free checkup. Like, have we kind of thought about education programs in partnership with folks like Pepco to try to encourage residents in the city to have some of those free energy audits, to have Pepco to come out and change your light bulbs to LEDs instead of, you know, like little things like that, that may seem small, but could ultimately help a homeowner to do some of the acts that we would encourage homeowners to do.
I'd say Gina's stepping stone work of the last couple of years is what you're talking about, and we reached 20% of the communities participating and more hearing about it, and that was a good first step, but ultimately not a big enough step or a strong enough step. So following that up while still having those voluntary programs and rebates that are available until we get the new inventory, the new action plan, and probably a new program that is more mandatory.
Gina, are the home energy audits still available for people who would like them?
Yeah, so in 2015 to 16, we sent canvassers door to door to promote that those PEPCO programs. And the city enhanced the PEPCO rebates for the full energy audit to encourage people to take advantage. So we were offering free comprehensive home energy audits. So residents could choose either the quick checkup or the comprehensive home energy audit and get either for free. We had 25, based on the best information I have, 25% of single-family homes have gotten either service, but only 5% of the single-family homes have gone on to make the significant weatherization improvements to their homes. So it's something that we need to continue to encourage and to continue to help educate residents on. I continue to offer free energy coaching to residents anytime they have an audit or a quick home energy checkup and have questions, and we continue to offer an additional rebate to residents to enhance those PEPCO programs. But we've reached sort of a plateau of interest and uptake of those voluntary programs.
Oh, go.
For those that are in the single-family homes but are renters, like, are we following up perhaps with property owner? Is it property owner direct outreach or just, kind of door to door, whoever happens to?
So we did that in 2015. We have not. That was sort of the limited 1-year program where we were really promoting that so heavily.
And just real quick, do you know why the adoption rate was so low? Did you get any feedback from people say, well, we went through the process and we didn't go to the next step because?
I think actually our adoption rate was quite high compared to other utility-sponsored programs and their conversion rate from quick home energy checkup or energy audit to improvement project.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
But
All you have
was
to do
there-
is watch the mayor's house.
I know, I was
give
gonna say, as someone who went through the process and then had a bunch of work done in my home, which was great. It was time consuming, and it cost us money. Even though we did get money back, it was still
Money up
It's
front.
yeah,
expensive.
it was, yeah. And so I think one of the things is, as Gina has mentioned, is the volunteer part has we've plateaued in terms of the commitment we're gonna get from folks. Because it's one thing to do the free energy audit, and then when you get those list of things to do in your house, and realizing, oh, that means drilling into this wall, that means then painting this wall afterwards. Taking that next step and just even figuring out when to schedule that, and then all of that does take a pretty big commitment, so.
Well, it does beg the question, how does the city communicate and help educate and raise these issues and alert people when, a free audit is offered by PEPCO? So I'm not convinced that the voluntary stuff is, I support more mandatory measures, but if the city would do an annual mailing to every resident saying, here's what's out there for free, and here are a few simple steps you can do, and you're virtually guaranteed to save money. I don't know what a mailing costs to every resident in town, but that's the sort of commitment that I think we'll need to make to start getting these issues in front of people on a more regular basis.
I think that unless something is mandatory, people will not even do the audit, because why would, if you weren't planning to spend the money on it, on doing the construction, why get the audit? And of the people who get it on a voluntary, just to figure it out, then you get these kind of results. So, and it's just like with recycling, it's not mandatory.
Well, except
Actually, it is.
one
Well,
difference is,
it's not enforced in any way.
but one difference is potentially, it costs a lot to make the kinds of repairs that Kate was talking about, and we did some in our house too. But I wonder how much of it is fixing the house as opposed to just behaving differently in the sense of, I don't know, setting your thermostat lower or whatever it is. It doesn't cost anything, and it saves you something, but you just have to, you have to understand to do it. And so if you can't afford to pay, $1,000 or whatever it might cost to make all these repairs to make your house more airtight, but you could do a series of steps over the year that could end up saving you maybe the same percentage. I mean, how much of what's needed here has to come from changing something physical about the house or home versus behaving differently? They both obviously contribute to it, but I mean, because that's the type of thing you could put tips in the newsletters and so on. And I know some people read the newsletter more than others, but it's free to be a little bit colder at night, right?
Well, only the cost of the woolen hat.
So the approaches do need to be twofold. There's occupant behavior, and then there's actually improving the quality of building stock in the city, regardless of occupant behavior. And both parts are necessary. We can't have one without the other. And I think the bottom line is that people, normal people, not the people in this room, they're interested in putting the money in their house, in their kitchens, and their bathrooms, and not in insulation and caulk and spray foam. So that's part of the reason why the uptake voluntarily is not 100%, because people put their money in the cosmetics.
But I will say, I do agree that we can't abandon the voluntary and the information, because the reminders are always really important.
Yeah. And especially as weather gets extreme, winter and summer are great times to do those reminders. Do that.
So the program results that I've seen, this kind of response rate for a voluntary program that's a citywide program is really quite good. That said, maybe there's some neighborhoods that didn't have such high participation for whatever reason. Maybe we should think about doubling back in a couple of targeted neighborhoods as doing continuing the education.
Building on that a little bit, I think it might be useful just to send out a simple reminder, whether it's on Twitter or some other, in the newsletter, some other fashion, just looping back to people who did do the audits, to remind them that they might have gotten some information about things they could do to update their house, and maybe they haven't done it. I know for myself, I had a young baby at the time, and we did some of the things that were recommended to us, but we didn't do all of them. And if we got that reminder, we might think, oh yeah, we had that list, we were gonna do X, Y, Z. Maybe we would go back and do it now. So that might be just a simple reminder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think too that with the education, one thing that we've talked about is that it's complicated to make your house substantially more sustainable. It's not as simple. Even if we had a ton of money with older homes, it can be really hard to figure out the building science to do that successfully without, creating mold or other air quality issues. I think that education, that's sort of where the rubber meets the road, meeting people where they are, will be a hinge point for our success in being able to push to the next level of sustainability and resiliency. I think the council, your enthusiasm is amazing and so wonderful. We're so lucky to get to work together. And of course, on the committee, we have tons of expertise in lots of different areas. So it'll be great to go forward into the year and try to figure it out together.
Great. All right, well, I think Elizabeth has this nice, you guys are doing nice transitions tonight. I love it when that happens in a meeting. The notes that I took, and I would love to hear from the committee on next steps that you see, but just to sort of recap the conversation we had after discussing the two big priorities on action steps is, keeping in mind the sustainability action plan over the next 6 to 12 months. That's the big thing. Potentially looking at what it means to declare a climate change emergency. We talked about what it would mean to do a consumption-based emission survey. Is that the right terminology? Okay. And then there was discussion that around building codes and energy standards, but I'm going to kind of lump them into talking about maybe moving towards mandatory programs or policies, as we talked about, in addition to the complementary volunteer programs. We talked about stormwater. And did I miss anything?
Like at getting control of our grid. in
Yes,
Tacoma
thank
Park.
you, yes. Yeah.
That was the electric grid, right, John?
Yeah, so if we can require that Pepco can only send renewable energy through wires in Tacoma Park.
Right. And that's the bill that Delegate Charkoudian is moving for, is that correct? Is
Yeah,
that-
that's, I was just about to say, I've got a draft of that this afternoon.
Okay.
So we can talk about that.
I'd like to add one larger thing which may confound things a little bit is that if we're successful in our housing development goals, whatever they end up being, if that's adding new residents or adding new businesses and economic development, that should contribute to a rise in absolute emissions. So maybe one of the ways that we should be measuring and looking at our inventories is a per capita or per revenue type of metric, so that we can still see efficiency gains in the vitality of the community and the economy of the community without saying we failed because we didn't have an absolute emissions reduction.
Well, from a climate change perspective, absolute emissions cost more than, mean more than per capita.
Not ignore, but also, we could have a lot of efforts and say that there weren't any results, or there weren't enough results, because we're not having an absolute decline. But we can also at least count whatever. We can balance it out. If we, I don't know that we're having an influx of new residents and businesses in the next 10 years, but I think that's part of some of the goals.
Yeah.
That
But
we
if we're
should at
looking
least be
at a region,
aware of what that's contributing. But maybe that's there's an argument to moderate how much development there is.
Okay. And then I just want to add also, because we will be working on it this year, not to lose sight, and you do have it here under your priorities, the work that we are doing on the tree canopy and the tree ordinance, and looking at straws. Even though things may, again, have support, they do take up time. And so we don't want them to be lost in the shuffle of things. Looking at then next steps, does the committee have any thoughts on how we should proceed, or?
At least one version was to take, one step is to take our proposed priorities and add in stormwater and adaptation language. I don't know if there are other specific items to add to this document, and then pass that back to you quickly for current adoption or carrying that forward for the next year. It's a working document that we should be reviewing every year. So that's one action step. We're planning, I think, to address the climate change emergency question at our next meeting. And maybe talk about some of those other issues, but the one specific revising of the document is on my list.
Great. And I would
don't know if
just
you have
add,
any
as you were
requests of
going,
us at the moment.
I just add, as you're going through the action items we talked about and the priorities, because we will be moving into the budget soon. So if there are things that you're thinking have budget implications, those are good to know sooner rather than later, to bring those to us. I'm sure we're already planning for the sustainability action plan, so that's good. We have that. But if there are other things, that would be good to know sooner rather than later. Anything else from Councilwoman DeBala? Your light's on. Okay, sorry. No, it's just on. Great. Well, I want to just say thank you. Sorry we're in this room and we're we're not sitting all around together. We usually like to be in the other room to be able to do that, but I really appreciate your flexibility and coming here at 6 o'clock tonight so that we could get this meeting in before we do our priority setting over the next week. This is terrific work, and we look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.